Elijah Harper wasn't looking for love. Not after the quiet unraveling of a 4-year relationship left him certain that real connection was behind him. But when a last-minute dinner invitation leads him to Lila Moreno, a fiercely warm gallery coordinator with a laugh like music, something begins to shift. What follows isn't a whirlwind romance, but a quiet, unfolding kind of love. The kind built not on grand gestures, but on coffee shop conversations, shared silence, and the choice to stay even when it gets hard. This is a story about finding home in another person, one ordinary, extraordinary moment at a time. Hello family, welcome to Storytime with Imzi. Please subscribe and like, it means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. By the time January crept in, Elijah Harper had almost made peace with the quiet. The city had curled into itself like an old dog against the cold. Days barely broke past a dim gray, and nights fell early, muffling everything in frost and silence. His 4th-floor apartment in the Marlow district was a small corner of stillness in an otherwise busy world. Just 3 rooms, with bare walls and minimalist furniture, clean to the point of sterility. It looked less like someone lived there, and more like someone had passed through. Elijah liked to tell himself that he preferred the silence. That the lack of noise, of clutter, of unnecessary movement, these were signs of clarity, of focus. But the truth was more complicated. It had been 7 months since he and Mara Whitmore ended things. 4 years together, dismantled over 3 difficult conversations and 1 final coffee in a downtown cafe. There had been no shouting, no cheating, no tragedy to point to. Just exhaustion. The quiet kind. The kind that shows up in forgotten anniversaries, half-finished sentences, and too much scrolling at dinner. Now Elijah moved through his life with a kind of polite detachment. He worked as a senior designer for a branding agency that cared more about marketable buzzwords than the art itself, but it paid well. His days were filled with mood boards, font choices, and soft clapping over virtual calls. Evenings, though, that was when the silence crept in. He cooked for 1. Ate standing up sometimes. Other nights, he ordered from the same 3 restaurants and ate in front of his laptop, watching nature documentaries he could never finish. Friends still invited him out, but the invitations had become more spaced, like echoes fading into a canyon. He always had an excuse, tired, behind on work, not feeling well. The truth was, he didn't know how to be around other people without faking ease. Even his apartment had grown colder somehow. The living room was sparsely decorated. A single bookshelf with worn paperbacks, a steel floor lamp that buzzed faintly when turned on, and a gray couch that was too firm to be comfortable. A framed photo of his parents sat on the windowsill, beside a plant he'd forgotten to water for weeks. Outside, headlights cut through the dusk like flashlights through smoke. Elijah stood by the window most evenings, a mug of lukewarm tea in his hands, watching the blur of the city go on without him. Couples rushed home with groceries, bundled in shared scarves. Someone played trumpet 3 blocks down, the notes warbling in the icy wind. The world, it seemed, still pulsed with connection. His didn't. He hadn't lost faith in love entirely, just in the idea that it would find him again. He'd told himself he was fine on his own, that healing took time, that space was necessary. But as the weeks wore on, even he could hear the hollowness in those justifications. Sometimes, at night, Elijah would lie awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the radiator ticking like a slow metronome. And in those quietest hours, when even the city gave up its noise, he allowed himself to whisper the one thing he would never say out loud. I miss being known. On the 2nd Friday of February, just as Elijah Harper was settling into the idea that the weekend would be another quiet blur, his phone buzzed. Once, then again, insistent against the wooden armrest of the couch. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from Nadia Patel, his oldest friend, and one of the last people still trying to pull him out of the emotional quicksand he'd slowly sunk into since the breakup. Dinner for Theo's birthday. Amalfi's. 8 p.m. Come. Don't be a hermit. Elijah sighed, the kind that deflated his entire frame. His first instinct was to ignore it. The thought of loud laughter, clinking glasses, and pretending he was doing fine made his chest tighten. He hadn't been to a real social gathering in months, and the idea of meeting new people exhausted him more than staying in ever could. He started typing out a polite refusal. Appreciate it, but I think I'm just going to. He paused, stared at the blinking cursor, deleted it. A strange stillness filled the room. The kind that made you hear your own heartbeat and your own excuses, just a little too clearly. There was nothing waiting for him here except reheated pasta and another half-watched documentary about penguins. He set his phone down and stood slowly. By 7:45, Elijah was shrugging into a navy wool sweater, the one he always wore when he needed to look like he'd tried. Outside, the city was damp with the aftermath of a light drizzle. Puddles shimmered on the sidewalk, catching the amber glow of street lamps and neon storefronts. It smelled faintly of wet asphalt and cold air, a winter evening dressed up as something romantic. Amalfi's was tucked into a quiet stretch of 9th Street, its windows glowing warmly against the gray. Inside, the smell of garlic and tomato hung thick in the air, mixing with bursts of laughter and the clatter of plates. The jazz trio in the corner was already halfway through something smooth and slow. Elijah. Nadia waved him over from a long table set for 10. Her dark curls were pinned up, and she was already halfway into a glass of red wine. I was starting to bet against you. He offered a small smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. I figured I owed you a social appearance. Damn right you did. Come, sit. He slid into an empty chair toward the middle of the table, nodding to a few familiar faces. Theo, as always, was mid-story, gesturing dramatically with a breadstick. The table rippled with laughter. Elijah reached for a menu, trying to ease into the rhythm of it all. And then he noticed her. She was seated across the table, just slightly diagonal, far enough that he could watch her without being obvious, close enough that he couldn't ignore her if he tried. Her laugh was the first thing he noticed. Not loud or showy, but genuine, the kind of sound that made you want to know the joke. Her hair was dark and wild, tumbling past her shoulders in soft curls, and her eyes, hazel, maybe, or green, caught the candlelight like glass catching flame. At some point, she looked up and met his gaze. She didn't look away. Elijah, this is Lila Moreno, Nadia said, as if the introduction were an afterthought. She works with Theo at the gallery. Lila extended a hand, her grip confident but warm. Nice to meet you, she said, her voice low and slightly amused. You too, Elijah replied, suddenly hyper-aware of how long it had been since he'd felt anything like curiosity about a stranger. The conversation shifted, but something lingered in the space between them. A mutual curiosity, quiet and unspoken. They didn't talk much that first hour, just the occasional comment, a few exchanged glances. But it was enough. Enough for Elijah to feel the rust inside him start to shift. Enough to remember what it was like to wonder about someone again. By the time dessert arrived, she was laughing again, at something Theo said probably, but her eyes slid back to Elijah's. It was fleeting, but in that one look, something unfamiliar flickered in his chest. A spark, small but stubborn. By the time the group spilled out of Amalfi's onto the damp sidewalk, the rain had returned in a soft, misty veil. The street shimmered under golden lamplight, reflections dancing in puddles like half-forgotten dreams. Everyone was full and talkative, wrapped in coats and scarves, dragging out goodbyes like people who didn't want the night to end. Lila Moreno stood a little apart from the crowd, tugging her curls into a loose bun as she laughed at something Theo said. Elijah hadn't meant to linger, but his feet had stayed rooted there, a few paces from her, his hands in his coat pockets, heart doing that quiet, uncertain thump it hadn't done in a long time. She turned toward him then, eyes finding his without hesitation. You're not much of a talker, she said, stepping closer, her breath forming small clouds between them. Elijah smiled, not defensive, just honest. Not at first. Takes me a while. Lila nodded, as if that answer satisfied something she hadn't asked out loud. I like that. They started walking, away from the rest of the group, who were now organizing an impromptu bar detour. Elijah didn't remember suggesting it, and Lila didn't seem surprised he had joined her instead. The street was quieter in this direction. Trees stripped bare for the season lined the sidewalk like skeletons, their branches clawing at the sky. You design things, right? She asked, glancing over. Yeah, mostly branding and digital stuff. Logos, websites, packaging. Cool. I can barely draw a straight line. He chuckled. Neither can I, half the time. She smiled at that. The easy kind. Not polite. Not performative. What about you? He asked. I manage events at the Whitaker Gallery. It sounds fancier than it is. Mostly I schedule angry artists and make sure the espresso machine doesn't explode before donors show up. That sounds, he tilted his head, unpredictable. That's a nice way of putting it. She laughed. But I like it. Every week's a new mess. Keeps me on my toes. They reached a small park, a narrow wedge of green tucked between two old apartment buildings. It wasn't much, a few benches, a cast-iron fence, and a rusted playground covered in damp leaves. But the city had stilled around them, the rain soft as breath, and something about the moment felt strangely suspended. I've been in a bit of a hibernation, Elijah admitted, his voice quieter now. Lila didn't ask for details. Didn't press. Just said, I figured. Oh, you've got that recently emotionally scorched vibe. He blinked, then laughed, really laughed, surprised at how good it felt. That obvious? Only to people who've worn it too. They stood there for a while, not talking, just listening to the drizzle and the occasional car passing on the main road. A comfortable silence. One that didn't ask to be filled. Eventually, Lila turned to him again. You want to keep walking, or should we call this a strangely charming end to a birthday dinner? He looked at her, really looked. At the steadiness in her gaze, the unforced warmth in her voice. There was no pretense here. No game. Just a woman who intrigued him in a way he hadn't felt in years. I wouldn't mind more of this, he said. She smiled. Good. Me neither. And with that, they walked back into the night. Not holding hands, not speaking in grand gestures. Just side by side, step for step. Two people quietly beginning something, whether they knew it or not. For the next few days, Elijah tried not to think about her. He tried not to remember the way Lila's laughter had lingered in the air like music long after she'd gone, or how effortlessly she'd peeled back parts of him he thought he'd packed away for good. He went to work, answered emails, stared at fonts and layouts and marketing copy, but none of it held his attention the way it usually did. His thoughts, irritatingly and persistently, kept drifting back to her, to the easy rhythm of their conversation, to the stillness between them that hadn't felt awkward, just full. To the look she gave him when she said, me neither. And yet, he didn't reach out. It wasn't pride. It was fear. That old, familiar kind. The one that whispers that maybe you imagine the connection. Maybe she was just being kind. Maybe she forgot your name the minute she stepped into her apartment. He had no real reason to believe any of that, of course. But after a long stretch of solitude, hope can feel suspicious. Even dangerous. 3 days passed. Then 4. By the 5th, he had almost convinced himself that the spark he'd felt was just a fluke. That he'd misread everything. He didn't dwell on it exactly. Just tucked it away like a note in a drawer that might be opened one day, but not today. Until, at exactly 6:12 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, his phone buzzed. Lila Moreno. Hey, I've been thinking about that walk. Want to continue the conversation over coffee sometime? Elijah stared at the screen for a long second, reading it once, then again, as if the words might change if he blinked. She had messaged him. She had been thinking about it too. She wanted more. For a man who made a living choosing the right words and arranging them just so, he suddenly found his fingers clumsy on the keyboard. He typed, deleted, retyped, and finally settled on. I'd like that. A lot. She replied almost instantly. Saturday? There's this place near the gallery. Quiet, cozy. Good lattes. Saturday works. Send me the name. I'll be there. After that, he couldn't stop smiling. Not a grin. Not something performative or foolish. Just that quiet kind of smile. The one that comes from feeling seen, remembered, chosen. He spent the rest of the evening trying to read a book, then pacing his apartment, then changing the subject every time his brain tried to rehearse how their next conversation might go. And later that night, when the city had gone still again and the radiator ticked its usual tired rhythm, Elijah lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Not with loneliness this time, but with anticipation. Something was beginning. And this time, it didn't feel fragile. It felt possible. Saturday arrived with the soft glow of winter sunlight streaming through a veil of pale clouds. The city had thawed slightly overnight, just enough to turn the sidewalks slushy and wet, though no one seemed to mind. People moved with coats open and scarves loosened, sensing spring somewhere on the far edge of the season. Elijah arrived 10 minutes early. The Café Verona was tucked into a quiet side street near the Whitaker Gallery, just as Lila had said. It was small but welcoming, the kind of place where baristas knew your name and everything came served in ceramic mugs instead of paper cups. The smell of espresso, cinnamon, and old novels seemed baked into the walls. He chose a table near the window, wiped a nervous hand across his jeans, and tried not to look like he was scanning the door every 30 seconds. He hadn't dated, really dated, in nearly 2 years. And even before that, with Mara, things had been practical more than passionate. Comfortable, like a sweater that had slowly worn thin at the elbows. But this was different. When Lila walked in, wearing a burgundy coat and carrying a tote bag printed with abstract brushstrokes, Elijah's heart responded before his brain caught up. She spotted him immediately and smiled, wide, genuine, like she was happy to see him. Not polite, not curious. Happy. You beat me, she said, unwrapping her scarf. I was early, he admitted, standing as she Saturday. I didn't want to risk being late. She raised an eyebrow, amused. You're either extremely punctual or extremely nervous. He grinned, sheepish. Bit of both. They ordered, an oat milk latte for her, a black coffee for him. And before long, their conversation picked up not where it had ended, but as if it had never stopped at all. They talked about childhoods. Lila growing up in Santa Fe with 2 sisters and a stubborn golden retriever named Hugo. Elijah in Chicago, an only child with an architect father who built dollhouses for fun and a mother who taught poetry, but never wrote her own. They talked about art, about the pressure of needing to produce something valuable, about the difference between creating to express and creating to sell. Lila admitted she still painted in secret, but only abstracts. The messier, the better. Elijah said he sketched in a notebook sometimes, mostly when his mind wouldn't shut off. There were moments of laughter, easy, honest, unfiltered. And other moments, quieter ones, where their eyes would hold for just a little too long, and neither of them would look away. Hours passed unnoticed. The cafe grew busier, then quieter again. A pair of college students claimed the corner, textbooks open and ignored. A toddler spilled cocoa near the counter. The light shifted slowly, casting long amber streaks across the floorboards. At one point, Lila leaned back, her cup nearly empty, her gaze drifting toward the window. You know what's weird? She said, voice softer now. I don't usually feel this comfortable. Not this fast. Elijah nodded. Neither do I. They sat in the quiet again. Not the kind that fills a space with awkwardness, but the kind that says, I could sit here with you for a long time and never run out of things to not say. When it came time to leave, neither of them made a move at first. But eventually, coats were shrugged back on, and mugs returned to the counter. Outside, the slush had frozen in thin sheets along the curb, the temperature dropping again. I'm glad you texted, Elijah said as they stood on the sidewalk, breath mingling in small puffs. I was nervous too, she admitted. I wasn't sure you'd want to see me again. I wasn't sure I could stop thinking about you. That made her smile in that slow, disarming way he was already starting to crave. She stepped forward, not quite a hug, but close enough that he could smell the faint citrus in her hair. Her voice was quiet when she said, Let's do this again. Soon. Absolutely. And then she was gone, disappearing into the early dusk like a promise made softly but surely. Elijah stood there for a while, feeling something new bloom beneath his ribs. Not a grand gesture. Not a cinematic moment. Just the quiet certainty of something beginning that mattered. In the weeks that followed, Elijah and Lila fell into a rhythm so natural it felt less like discovery and more like remembering something they had always known. It wasn't marked by fireworks or declarations or whirlwind weekends. There were no passionate confessions in the rain. No dramatic turning points. Just slow, steady unfolding, like petals in warm sunlight. Saturday coffees became Sunday walks. Weeknight texts turned into late-night phone calls that lasted longer than they should have, both of them half laughing through sleepy voices, unwilling to hang up. He started to recognize her moods by the tone of her messages. She began to notice when his silences meant focus and when they meant worry. One weekend, Lila invited him over to help rearrange her living room. What began as furniture shuffling turned into takeout eaten cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by record sleeves and stacks of unshelved books. He discovered she couldn't cook to save her life, but insisted on trying anyway. She learned he sang to himself while folding laundry, soft and tuneless, as if the habit had been built long before he realized it was audible. There were shared playlists and grocery runs, mismatched coffee mugs in each other's cabinets, a toothbrush left behind by accident, and then left there on purpose. But it wasn't just the domestic softness that made it real. It was the quiet things. The way Elijah paused a few seconds longer before answering serious questions, and how Lila never rushed to fill that space. The way she touched his hand during movies, absent-minded grounding, not performative. The way he listened when she spoke about work, her frustrations with scheduling, the passive-aggressive gallery donors, the exhaustion that came from being the calm one at every event. And in turn, Lila noticed the things Elijah didn't say. The long pauses when he talked about his parents. How he sometimes hesitated before letting himself enjoy something too much, as if happiness might break if held too tightly. They never used the word love. Not yet, but it hung in the air like a song playing in another room. Too faint to sing along with, too loud to ignore. One particularly cold Sunday morning, they walked through the farmer's market near Clement Street, wrapped in layers and sipping overpriced cider. Elijah pointed out a stall selling hand-bound sketchbooks and said, almost shyly, "I used to draw more." Before things got complicated. Lila bought one without a word and handed it to him before they left, her hand brushing his. "Maybe things are uncomplicated now," she said. That night, he opened it and drew something. Nothing elaborate, just lines and shapes and movement. But it felt like reclaiming a part of himself. A part he'd almost forgotten was still there. He didn't show her the sketch. Not yet. But when he texted thank you just before midnight, she sent back a single emoji. A heart, the kind made of simple lines, not glitter or flame. He stared at it for a long moment before smiling to himself. It wasn't falling fast. It wasn't falling loud. But it was falling. And maybe Elijah thought that was the most real kind of love there was. It happened on a Thursday. Not the fight, but the shift, the subtle change in the air that hinted something was about to go wrong. The day had started like any other. Elijah woke early, answered emails from under the covers, and planned to meet Lila for dinner after her gallery shift. She had texted him at noon. "Today's chaos. Just need wine and silence later. You in?" He'd replied, "Always." But by 8:30 p.m., they were sitting across from each other in a quiet booth at Garwin's, their favorite little bistro tucked behind the art district, and something was off. Elijah was tired. He'd had a long week and a demanding client who had changed his mind 3 times on a brand refresh. His head hurt. His patience was thin. He hadn't told her any of that. Lila was distracted, preoccupied with a major exhibition that had just fallen apart. An artist pulled out last minute, citing philosophical differences, which really meant ego. She hadn't told Elijah that either, not fully. She didn't want to bring stress into what was supposed to be their safe space. They danced around each other for most of the meal, exchanging updates like co-workers, not lovers. Lila noticed Elijah seemed distant. Elijah noticed she kept checking her phone. Each one waited for the other to speak first. Neither did. Then came the small thing, because it's always a small thing. Lila mentioned a new curator who'd joined the gallery team. Elijah asked if he was the one she'd texted during dinner. She raised her brow at the question. "No," she said evenly. "And even if it was, I didn't know texting someone at work required clearance." It wasn't a dramatic statement. There was no heat in it. But the tone, sharp and chilled, caught Elijah off guard. He said nothing. Looked away. The silence that followed was heavier than anything they'd shared before. They didn't fight that night. Not exactly. But something fractured. For the first time, the connection between them felt fragile. Real in its complexity. Lila left early with a quick, tired kiss that barely touched his cheek. Elijah stood in the parking lot for a while afterward, hands deep in his coat pockets, staring at his own reflection in a restaurant window. The next morning, neither of them texted first. Hours passed. Then a day. Then 2. And with each moment, the unspoken distance between them widened. Not because they stopped caring, but because they didn't know how to navigate the silence without hurting each other further. It was Lila who broke the silence. Sunday afternoon. She showed up at his apartment unannounced, holding 2 coffees and wearing that storm-ready expression she usually saved for gallery emergencies. "I don't want to pretend this isn't a thing," she said, standing in his doorway. "But I also don't want to run just because it got complicated." Elijah stepped aside to let her in. He didn't say anything at first. Just stood there, watching her set the coffees down on the kitchen counter, like someone trying to reclaim familiar ground. "I don't know how to do this part," he said finally. "I've always either fixed things fast or left." "I'm not asking you to fix anything," she said, looking at him. "I just want you to stay. With me. In it. Even when it's messy." The silence that followed was long, but it was different this time. Braver. He walked to her and took her hand. Not as a gesture of apology, but as a promise. "I'll stay," he said. And that was it. No sweeping kiss. No orchestral swell. Just 2 people choosing each other, imperfect, overwhelmed, but still reaching across the crack that had formed. Because the truth about real love, they were learning, wasn't in how perfectly you danced around the storm. It was in how you held on when the rain came. It didn't happen during a kiss. It didn't happen on a mountaintop or in the middle of some dramatic proclamation. The moment Elijah Harper knew, really knew, that he had fallen in love with Lila Moreno came on a Tuesday morning. It was raining. Not the cinematic kind, just a steady drizzle that painted the city in muted tones. He had woken up to the sound of it pattering against the window and the faint scent of coffee already drifting through the apartment. For a few seconds, he forgot she was staying over. It was still new, her presence in his home. Not quite permanent, not quite occasional. Somewhere in between. He padded into the kitchen barefoot, wearing yesterday's t-shirt. She was there, dancing, poorly cheerfully, to a quiet soul track playing from her phone. Her hair was piled into a messy bun. One of his sweaters, comically oversized on her, slipped off one shoulder as she stirred something on the stove. She saw him and grinned. "Mr. Harper," she said, without turning down the music, "how do you feel about cinnamon in your eggs?" "I feel deeply suspicious." She tossed him a dish towel, laughing. "You need to live more dangerously." He leaned against the counter, watching her move. There was nothing remarkable about the scene. Just a rainy morning. Just 2 people who had chosen to keep showing up for each other. And yet, something in him quietly cracked open. There were no words for it, not then. But he felt it. Not the jolt of infatuation, not the spike of lust or longing. This was quieter. Deeper. Like a tide that had been coming in all along, unnoticed, until suddenly he was standing ankle-deep in something vast and still and irreversible. It was in the way she existed so fully in her own skin. In the way her joy filled a room without asking permission. In how she never demanded his vulnerability, only made space for it. She burned the toast that morning. Elijah didn't care. He was too busy memorizing the way she hummed when she cooked, the way she danced like no one was watching, even when she knew he was. Later that day, as they sat on the couch, sharing a blanket and a bowl of soup she insisted she made from absolute wizardry, Elijah looked at her, and the words came without planning. "I love you," he said. Lila didn't flinch, didn't blink, just smiled, steady and sure, as if she'd known all along and had simply been waiting for him to catch up. "I know," she said. "Me too." They didn't need to say more. Because this messy, gentle, steady thing they were building, it wasn't about grand moments. It was about mornings like this. The ordinary ones. The real ones. And that's how Elijah met the love of his life. Not through fate. Not through fireworks. But through a quiet unfolding. One cup of coffee, one laugh, one choice at a time.